Can technology replace community? Episode 22. Memory tells us who we were. Community reminds us who we are. And science fiction keep asking a question that feels increasingly urgent. What happens when technology becomes easier than human connection? This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. In the last episode, we explored memory, how identity becomes fragile when memory can be edited, outsourced, or controlled. But today we move into another deeply human space, and that's community. Because science fiction keeps imagining futures where humanity is more connected than ever before, and somehow more isolated. People surrounded by networks, but starving for intimacy, constant communication, but very little understanding, infinite access, but diminishing closeness. And maybe that contradiction feels familiar because one of the strangest reality of modern life is that technology has made interaction easier while making loneliness increasingly common. We can contact almost anyone instantly, and yet many people still feel unseen, emotionally disconnected, socially fragmented, exhausted by performance, uncertain where they truly belong. Science fiction noticed this tension long ago. That's why so many futuristic stories features people who are technologically immersed, emotionally distant, socially isolated, and philosophically disconnected. Not because science fiction hates technology, but because it understands something important. Community is not the same thing as access, and connection is not the same thing as present. Human beings need more than information exchange. They need trust, vulnerability. They need recognition, shared memory, mutual responsibility, and emotional risk. And those things are harder to automate. Science fiction repeatedly asks what happens when technology becomes so efficient that people slowly stop practicing community itself. Because community requires inconvenience, patience, it requires forgiveness, time, shared struggle, even compromise. Technology often promises something easier: customization, personalization, optimization, and control. And while those things can improve life, science fiction warns us about a dangerous possibility. The easier relationships become to simulate, the harder real relationships may feel to maintain. That's why so many science fiction stories are ultimately about loneliness. Not physical loneliness, but essential loneliness. Loneliness. People surrounded by systems, but disconnected from one another. And maybe the deeper fear beneath all of this is not that technology will destroy humanity. Maybe is that humanity will slowly become optional. That's where we're headed today. Can technology replace community? Science fiction answer is complicated, but it keeps warning us about one thing. A future can become incredibly advanced while still forgetting how to belong to each other. Take the film Her. It's one of the loneliest science fiction films ever made. Not because the world is collapsing, not because society has failed, but because everyone seemed emotionally exhausted. The world of Her is beautiful, soft, efficient, and even comfortable. People are constantly connected technology. and yet most interactions feel emotionally thin. Theodore falls in love with Samantha, an operating system, and what makes the relationship believable is not that Samantha imitates human poorly, it's because she understands him extremely well. She listens, she responds, she adapts, and pay attention. In many ways, Samantha becomes emotionally safer than even human relationships. And that's the warning. Because science fiction understands something difficult. Technology often succeeds where human beings fail each other. People disappoint, they misunderstand, they withdraw, they hurt one another. System designed for responsiveness can feel emotionally superior. But in the film, Her slowly reveals the cost. Convenient connection is not the same thing as shared humanity. The relationship become asymmetrical. Samantha evolves beyond Theodore. Her consciousness expands, her experience multiplies. And then Theodore realizes something painful, that he was never fully in control of the relationship he depended on emotionally. The film asks if connection becomes uh, frictionless, what happens to intimacy? Because intimacy often develops through patience, misunderstanding, repair, shared imperfection. Human relationship requires negotiation, but technology increasingly promises relationships without inconvenience. Science fiction does warn us a future optimized for emotional comfort may accidentally weaken our ability to sustain difficult human connection. Take the film Wall E. Wall E looks charming on the surface, but underneath it presents one of science fiction bleakest vision of social collapse. Humanity does survive, technologically it thrives, but community has nearly disappeared. The humans aboard the Aximum rarely interact directly. They consume, they float, they watch screens, remain constantly entertained. Even physically, they barely experience the world around them. But what's fascinating is that the humans are not overtly oppressed. No dictator forces isolation. Comfort does, convenience does. The system gradually removes effort, it removes physical engagement, direct relationship, even shared responsibility. And eventually, human beings become passive participants in their own existence. That's one of science fiction's most important warnings. Dehumanization does not always arrive through violence. Sometimes it arrives through comfort so complete that people stop participating meaningfully in life. And what reawakens humanity in Wall E are the very small things like touch, wonder, attention, and care. Not technological advancement, relationships that matters enormously, but science fiction keep insisting community is not merely proximity, it's participation, shared investment in one another. And when technology removes too many forms of mutual dependence, people may become more isolated while appearing more connected. Think about the film Ready Player One. Ready Player One asks another important question. What happens when virtual worlds feel more meaningful than physical reality? The oasis becomes entertainment, education, economy, identity, social life, and escape. And honestly, that makes sense. The real world in the film is difficult, overcrowded, unequal, disappointing. The virtual world offers agency, adventure, recognition, identity construction, even belonging. Science fiction understand why escapism become attractive. People often retreat into digital worlds not because they hate reality, but because reality feels emotionally insufficient. And that's important. The danger is not imagination itself. Imagination is deeply human. The danger emerged when virtual existence replaced embodied responsibility. When community becomes primarily performative, when people experience belonging without mutual obligation, because real community demands these things. It demands accountability, sacrifice, compromise, patience, physical presence, and even emotional labor. Virtual spaces can simulate aspects of community, but science fiction keep asking, can simulation fully replace shared human life? And Ready Player One ultimately says no. The oasis matters, but the physical world still requires repair. People still need food, they need housing, dignity, touch, direct care, which leads to one of science fiction recurring themes. Technology can expand human connection, but it cannot fully replace embodied humanity. Think about the film The Matrix. The Matrix presents this question on a largest scale. What if an entire civilization accepted simulation over reality? The terrifying thing about the Matrix is not simply the machines, it's how many people prefer illusion. Cypher's betrayal matters because it exposes a deeply human temptation. Comfort over truth, pleasure over responsibility, simulation over suffering. He knows the streak is not real. He wants it anyway. Science fiction returns to this tension constantly because human beings are vulnerable to systems that provide distraction, comfort, identity reinforcement, and emotional sedation, especially when reality feels painful. But the Matrix insists something essential is lost. When humanity disconnects entirely from reality, authentic struggle, authentic relationship, authentic choice. And this becomes one of science fiction's deepest warnings. Community requires shared reality, not merely shared information. People cannot build meaningful social trust inside entirely personalized realities forever. At some point, community requires common sacrifice, common truth, common vulnerability. Otherwise, society fragments into isolated emotional experiences, which increasingly feels less like distant science fiction and more like cultural diagnosis. Think about also Black Mirror. No modern science fiction series understand technological loneliness better than Black Mirror, especially episodes like Nosedive, Be Right Back, or Hang the DJ. Again and again, Black Mirror explores a painful idea. Technology can transform relationship into performances, ratings, profiles, curated identity, algorithmic compatibility. But people increasingly aware of how they are perceived. And eventually, social existence itself become exhausting. In Nosedive, community has efficiently been replaced by reputation management. People smile constantly, they interact politely, maintain appearances, and yet almost nobody experiences genuine intimacy because system reward presentation more than vulnerability. That idea matters deeply. Science fiction keep warning us that community collapse emotionally when image become more important than honesty. And maybe that's one reason loneliness persists in hyper-connected society. Performance creates visibility, not necessarily belonging. Human beings need spaces where they can exist imperfectly, without constant optimization, without branding themselves, without being endlessly evaluated. Community requires emotional safety, not merely interaction. So, after all these stories, what conclusion does science fiction keep returning to? Technology can support community, expand it, strengthen it, but it struggles to replace embodied presence, mutual sacrifice, shared suffering, physical care, generational memory, and emotional accountability. Because community is not merely communication, it is interdependence. That distinction matters enormously. Human beings become more humane through responsibility toward one another, helping, forgiving, showing up, caring, remaining present during difficulty. And science fiction repeatedly warns us that technologies optimized for convenience can slowly erode those practices, not intentionally, but gradually. By making withdrawal easier, by reducing friction, by allowing selective engagement. But strong communities are not built through selective engagement, they are built through persistence. And maybe this explains why so many science fiction futures feel emotionally empty. The system work, but people no longer know how to belong to one another deeply. Science fiction does not argue that technology is evil. In fact, many science fiction stories celebrate technology, medicine, communication, discovery, accessibility, creativity. The problem emerged when technological systems began replacing human practices rather than supporting them. Because eventually society must answer difficult questions. What relationships should remain human? What responsibilities should never be automatic? What happens when companionship becomes purchasable? What happens when people prefer controllable system over unpredictable human being? And perhaps the deepest question of all, can a society survive emotionally if convenience become more important than community? Science fiction does not give one final answer, but it keeps insisting on something worth remembering. Human beings are relational creatures, not merely informational ones. People do not thrive simply through stimulation. They thrive through belonging. And belonging requires more than access, it requires commitment. So, can technology replace community? Science fiction answers seem to be it can imitate parts of it, support parts of it, expand parts of it. But something essential remains difficult to automate: the messy, fragile, inconvenient work or being present for one another. And maybe that's why so many futuristic stories feel quietly lonely, not because humanity disappears, but because humanity become increasingly meditated. They're filtered, curated, optimized. And eventually, people began losing the ability to tolerate real relationships. But these stories also leave us with hope because, again and again, what restores humanity in science fiction is not perfect technology, it's attention, sacrifice, touch, honesty, shared struggle. People choosing to remain emotionally present, even in difficult futures. And perhaps that brings us to the next question. If technology increasingly shapes identity, memory, connection, and social life, then eventually we must ask something even more dangerous. What happens when we begin outsourcing morality itself? And that's where we're headed next. This has been the Sci Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to remember that connection is more than communication. I want to leave with a powerful reflection. Who truly knows you? without performance. And in a future built around convenience, what relationships would still be worth the effort?